Hi, Dr. Scott. Here's my interactive read aloud that didn't tape when I was on campus. So we're going to get started. Hi, class. Welcome back from lunch. As you know, we always read stories when we come back. And this year we've read and listened to a few books, and we really enjoyed the stories. And today we're going to start a new story, but instead of just listening, we're going to look at how we know what's going on in the book behind the words. Many of you do this without even knowing it. But today I'm going to help you practice to make these skills stronger so that you can become even better readers than you are already. So the first thing we want to do before we start reading the stories, I want to ask you, how many of you have moved from one town or a city to another? And how many of you have joined a new school or a new activity where you didn't know anybody there at all? You were the new person on the block. Can you remember how you felt when you got to your new home or when you went to the first meeting of that activity? And can you remember what it was like to make new friends? Now, I want you to turn and talk to your desk partner, and I want you to tell them about how you felt when you moved or when you had to make new friends. Okay, I heard a lot of really good information out there, and it sounds like a lot of you have really experienced something like this. So today we're going to start reading the book called Because of Winn, Dixie. It's written by Kate DiCamillo. And she's written a few books that are similar to this, and I'm sure some of you have read some of her other books. This book is a fictional book. So remember when we talked about different kinds of books that tell a story that isn't really true? Well, that's what this book is. It is fictional. But in this case, the book is what's called realistic fiction because a lot of the experiences that our heroine or our main character are experiencing can really happen to somebody and could really take place. And she learns some really valuable lessons that can help us when we're making friends or when we have to move to a new place. So, keeping in mind your experiences with starting over and making friends like you talked with your desk mates, this will help you understand the story we're about to hear. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about some words that we're going to hear in the first part of our book. And if you know these words ahead of time, it'll help you understand the story a little bit better. So do you remember last week when we talked about words that have a couple different meanings? Well, two of these types of words show up in the first couple chapters of our book. The first one is the word produce. And some of you might have heard the word used as like you need to produce some homework or your mom wants you to produce some information that she wanted you to find out from her teacher. That's one way that you can use the word. The other way is you experience when you go to the grocery store. You know, the produce section where you buy fruits and vegetables, apples and potatoes and stuff like that. Well, that's the way we're going to use this word in the first part of the book, produce, like food. And another word that we're going to run into that has a double meaning is the word judge. Now, a lot of you know the meaning of the word judge is person who makes decisions in maybe court cases or contests. In the book, it's used to, I just forgot. It's used to make an opinion about somebody or to decide how you feel about what's going on. Two other words that I want to tell you about that give some extra meaning to the story, and they're very important to know. One is a missionary, and this is the word missionary. And a missionary is a person who travels far from their original home. They don't stay in one place for too long. And another word is the word or series of words trailer park. Now, we live in a really big city, and we don't see a lot of trailer parks in our area. And a trailer park is a place that has homes that can be moved from place to place. In today's world, the word trailer park, if you talk about someone that lives in a trailer park, it usually doesn't have good connotations or good meanings to it. People sort of look down on those people that live in trailer parks. While it's not always true about those people, that's kind of the way that it's used in the book. So you kind of have to know that ahead of time. And since we don't live in an area that has trailer parks, I put together a couple pictures that I want to pass around that you can see. And this is kind of what a trailer park looks like and what you might see in the areas where the trailer parks are. So I'll pass this around to all of you. You can take a look at it as we start reading. So before we start our story, you can remember back, you always take a look at the book and see if you can figure something out. So we're going to take a quick look at the cover. And I want you to look at it. And like I said, the name of the book is Because of Winn, Dixie. And the author is Kate DiCamillo. Who do you see or what do you see on the front of the book? Okay, good. I heard some people say there's a girl, there's a dog. But in the background, I want you to take a closer look. What is that you see there? We just talked about it. That's right. That's a trailer park. And a lot of the story takes place around a trailer park. So let's begin. What I'm going to do is I will be reading the book to you, as we normally do, but I'm going to be stopping here and there and giving you some ideas of what to think about or what to do while you're reading so that you can become a better reader. Okay? So we're going to get started with the book, Because of Winn, Dixie. Chapter 1. My name is India Opal Baloney, and last summer my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, 2 tomatoes, and I came back with a dog. Okay, let's take a stop here. She went to the grocery store. She came back with a dog. You guys know that going to a grocery store, you don't buy dogs there. So think in your mind, we'll listen to the rest of the story, we'll make a prediction, and tell me, how do you think she gets a dog at a grocery store? Okay, so let's go on. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn-Dixie grocery store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms around. "Who let a dog in here?" He kept on shouting. "Who let a dirty dog in here?" Okay, this is going to sound pretty funny, isn't it? Now what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to close your eyes. I want you to think about what I'm reading. Use what you know about a grocery store, the people that work there, and just imagine. I'll let you know when you can open your eyes. Okay, you ready? Everybody got their eyes closed? Here we go. Screaming manager, remember. At first, I didn't see a dog. There was just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers. And there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn-Dixie employees running around, waving their arms just the same way the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly, and he looked like he was having a really good time. His tongue was hanging out and he was wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I had never before in my life seen a dog smile, but that is what he did. He pulled back his lips, showed me all his teeth. Then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked over some oranges off a display, and they went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. You could tell that all he wanted to do was get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department, but somehow he ended up knocking over the manager. And the manager must have been having a bad day, because lying there on the floor, right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him, real concerned, and licked his face. Okay, you can open your eyes now, but keep that in mind while we're listening and sort of imagine what you're hearing. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered, "that's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn-Dixie employees turned around and looked at me, and I knew I had done something big, and maybe stupid too. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears up in the air and looked at me like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again. And then I figured that the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world, that he would want to get called by a name, only I didn't know what his name was. So I just said the first thing that came into my head. I said, "Here, Winn-Dixie." And that dog came trotting over to me, just like he had been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up, gave me a hard stare like maybe I was making fun of him. "It's his name," I said. "Honest." The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into the grocery store?" Yes, sir, I told him. He got in by mistake. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. Come on, Winn-Dixie, I said to the dog. I started walking, and he followed along behind me as I went out of the produce department and down the cereal aisle, past all the cashiers, and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful, and he didn't look that good. He was big but skinny. You could see his ribs. And there were bald patches all over him, mostly where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly, he looked like a big old piece of brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. You're a mess, I told him. I bet you don't belong to anybody. He smiled at me. He did that thing again, where he pulled back his lips and showed me his teeth. He smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, I know I'm a mess. Isn't it funny? It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. Come on, I told him. Let's see what the preacher has to say about you. And the two of us, me and Winn-Dixie, started walking home. So let's take a little break here, guys. And I want you to think about what you know about parents and pets. Okay? And what do you think the preacher will say about Winn-Dixie? So keep that information in your mind and think about it. And let's go on to chapter 2 and see what happens. Chapter 2. That summer I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that is how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what I told Winn-Dixie? You are a suffering dog, so maybe he will take you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk really bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. So let's take a little stop here. And think about what we just heard. Opal was talking to Winn-Dixie, almost like he was another human. And she tells us at the end, he was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. And that reminds me of how two friends are in real life. How you love each other, and you like being around each other, and you talk to each other, and tell each other stories. And you really like each other because of who you are, who they are, and not because of how they look or what they have. So let's go on. She's walking along with Winn-Dixie. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park. And the only reason that I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detweiler's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he's thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, Do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? Mm-hmm, he said. He rubbed his nose, looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things, and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, said the preacher. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn Dixie! Winn Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and he sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled really bad. Winn Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher, he is a stray if I've ever seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn Dixie behind the ears. And a less fortunate, too, that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked, real soft to Winn Dixie. Winn Dixie wagged his tail. Well, the preacher said, I guess we found one. So I want you to think about what we've heard so far. We know that Opal just moved from a new town. Do you think she has a lot of friends there right now as she's making her way home from the grocery store? Okay, so we got done with the first two chapters. At the beginning of the book, we talked a little bit about what it's like to move to a new place and not have any friends there. So think about Opal right now. Think about how she felt when the preacher sent her to the grocery store for the first time. And how do you think she feels now that she has Winn Dixie, who really appears to be a good friend to her? Okay, I want you to take a minute and turn and talk to your desk partner. And between you guys, I want you to think of two predictions of what's going to happen with Opal and Winn Dixie in the rest of the story. Okay, so I'll give you a minute to go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that you guys have all had a minute to do that, we're going to talk about some of the predictions that you've come up with for the rest of the story. And I'm going to write it on our T-chart here that's next to me. And we're going to keep this chart up on the wall. And the next time we go to keep reading our story, we're going to listen. And we're going to see if any of our predictions for the rest of the story come true. And I'm sure you're really going to like the rest of this book. Thanks for letting me try this again, Dr. Scott.